Good evening. My name is Neva Hassanen. I'm an associate professor here in the Environmental Studies program at the university. And it's my honor to welcome you to the Brennan Guth Memorial Lecture and the President's Lecture Series this evening. As a community, we're all actually touched by the life of Brennan Guth, whether we knew him or not. Many of us know his name because of this lecture series and because of the wave that was created in his honor downtown. As you may know, the Brennan's Wave was a broad citizen effort to memorialize the life of a world-class kayaker, environmentalist, and philosophy major from the University of Montana. Brennan was taken from us too soon in 2001 in a kayaking accident in Chile. But his family and friends created this lecture series as one way to sustain his memory. And in the process, we all have benefited by having an amazing array of speakers come to campus and share some of the most cutting-edge ideas in environmental thought today. I want to take this opportunity to thank Brennan's family, David and Pamela and Patricia, for their gift to the university and to the wider Missoula community, and this opportunity to remember Brennan's legacy. I'd also like to thank President Dennison for his ongoing support of the President's Lecture Series. So it's my honor to introduce you tonight David Orr, who is the Paul Sears Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies and Politics at Oberlin College. And as I was thinking about this introduction tonight, it got me thinking about, well, when did I first hear of David Orr's work? And I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, and I was studying with someone who was exploring this idea of food shed analysis. And you know, he's kept talking about, well, somebody must have done this before. And he uncovered this project that had been done in Arkansas at Hendrix College, where the students and faculty had looked at where the school's food was coming from. And they traced it back to feedlots, you know, far away in Texas, even though Hendrix was located in middle of cattle country. Like most places, about 90% of their food was coming to them from somewhere else. And as a result of this resource analysis that they did at Hendrix College, the college made a commitment to buying more food from local farmers and ranchers. Now, this was back in the 1980s, and the term farm to cafeteria had not yet been born. There were no farm to college projects in the country, no farm to school projects. Well, today, there are hundreds of colleges and over 1,000 school districts across the country that have committed to buying local food. Now, I mention this by way of introduction of David Orr, not because I want to go way back into his ancient history. Oh, it's not ancient. Well, sorry, David. But because, to me, it's emblematic of really the arc of his career. What he has done often is engage students and campuses in the critical task of asking, how shall we live in this place? And in the process, students gain ecological literacy, and universities and colleges come to model what sustainability might look like. And it's those demonstration projects and that combination of critical analysis on the one hand and practical competence on the other hand that has come to mark the educational philosophy and environmental thought that is embodied in David Orr's work, his scholarship, and his practice. And this is seen in numerous ways. Not only does he write about this moral imperative of the university, but also he has practiced it. For example, at Oberlin College, he has helped and led the effort to build the Adam Joseph Lewis Center, which is where their environmental studies program is housed. This was the first green building on a campus. So again, a first, really pushing the envelope for what universities can do and making it happen. He has had several other examples of this, but he's also been a prolific writer, and he's really pushed environmental thought in new directions. His first book, Ecological Literacy, is certainly a classic. Many of us have read it, no doubt, and if you haven't, you should. It still remains, I think, a classic and an example of how this university process should be engaged. He's also the author of Earth in Mind. He is an author. One of my favorite books is The Nature of Design, which tells the story in part of this work he's done to build the Lewis Center at Oberlin. But he also wrote Design on the Edge, more recently, The Last Refuge. And tonight he'll be talking with us about his latest book, which is Down to the Wire: Confronting Climate Collapse. The book will be available for sale after the lecture, and he'll be happy to sign it as well. Throughout his work, Orr has reminded us that sustainability is a moral imperative. He's been widely recognized as a leader in these areas. He's spoken at hundreds of colleges and universities throughout the United States and Europe. He served as the trustee and advisor for many organizations. His work has been recognized by the Obama administration. And I could go on and on. His biography is extensive. But let me wrap up by saying this, that many times in his career, we've seen this example where he has encouraged universities to step outside the traditional box and engage this moral imperative and engage our moral stake in the world as we educate students who will inherit this planet. From the Hendricks College Food Study to the first green building on a college campus, to getting campuses to adopt climate change action plans, which was an idea he put out in a 2000 article that he wrote, and now hundreds of campuses across the country have adopted this idea, to his latest initiative, which is an ambitious attempt to create a sustainable community around Oberlin. David Orr has repeatedly combined both practice and theory in a way that is a lesson to us all. Won't you please welcome David Orr?
Neva, thank you for a way too generous introduction, but I really appreciate the words. I actually had written some things she didn't say. So anyway, Neva, thank you very much. To the Guth family, David, Pat, Pam, thank you very much for your generosity with the lecture and the dialogue you've helped to foster here in this wonderful city. To Richard Drake, Kathy Zeiler, thanks for making arrangements for this, my visit. Derek Canwisher, who picked me up yesterday and was so hospitable. He picked me up in what is left of his 1981 Mercedes. And there's actually a lot left. Josh Slotnick and Albert Borgman and friends, Dan Kemis and Janine Benyus here in town. This is, in many ways, a wonderful homecoming for me to come back to Missoula. My secretary called this morning and said, you know, you're in competition with a lecture on the campus about why women want sex or something. And she said, there'll be nobody at your lecture. And so if you think that I'm going to talk about that, this is about a different form of heat. She assured me that there would be nobody here. So I'm delighted to see all of you. The talk I gave this afternoon is really the talk that should come after this one. They got, because of the way things worked out, that was the afternoon talk, but it's kind of the upshot. And what I'd like to do tonight is talk about the last roughly 4 years of my life when climate change has been, well, I've marinated in the subject of climate change. On the screen on either side of me, there is on the left-hand side, the front page of a document that about 250 of us worked on, a climate action plan for the next U.S. administration. And we started this in 2006. We spent about $1.4 million to develop a plan, and we aimed at the first 100 days of the next U.S. administration, be it Republican or Democrat, didn't matter. And that's at about 15,000 feet. The book on the right-hand side of the screen is down to the wire, and it's essentially a 35,000-foot meditation on what it means for us to live in this particular era. It was not written as a feel-good book. It was written as an honest book. And I've read a lot of books on 50 cost-effective ways to save the planet. I don't believe a bit of it. I think we need to go deeper and think more deeply about this. The afternoon talk was really about ground level. It's what am I doing about this? So this is a very personal journey for me. And so the attempt to build sustainability in Oberlin that Neva described, for me, is the response. What do we do in our places relative to the largest challenge humankind has ever faced, with the exception of nuclear war? And they both threaten human survival. They're both intertwined. We are in a deadly embrace with these two forces, and we've brought them on ourselves. These aren't from some other place. This is not God's choice for us. Choices that we will make, as Al Gore points out in his new book. So this is a talk about climate change. It is to me, it's very personal. And there's some things that we can do about it. But let me describe, there are many of you in the room, Steve Running among them, who know much more about the science of the subject than I do, so I'm going to sketch through that. And the take-home message in part is that this issue, we want to treat it, many people want to treat it first and foremost as an economic issue. And so there's lots of dialogue about how we can save the planet and make lots of money. And I don't believe that. There are some people who will make money in the next 25 years, but I don't believe that that rings true for people on the Tuvalu Islands, or for the 150,000 or so that we're told every year that die of climate change-driven weather events. Secondly, we're told it is a technical issue. And I think, as with economics, climate change or climatic change is both economic and technical, but it has gone well past that. It is now an issue of governance and ethics. And that's where I want to take you. So that's the take-home message. Truth in advertising. These are my grandkids. That's in the center, that's Lewis. Lewis told me last Christmas he wanted not just to make it to the big leagues, but he wants to make it to the Hall of Fame. And my head was going up and down like that. Lewis, I'll bet you can. You know, great athlete. My brain was going, no way, no how. I know 1/4 of the genes in your body, and you're a roadkill on the highway of ambition. You ain't going to get there. But he's full of life and lots of fun. That's his sister, Molly. And I work as a high-level advisor to Molly on matters pertaining to her interest in fairy princesses. And I didn't know this before. I raised 2 boys, but I never had a girl. But there are big, thick books at the public library on how you be a fairy princess, you know, how you curtsy and how you get your Prince Charming and so forth. Ruby Kate is on the left-hand side of the screen. Her mama is thoroughly Irish, and she's an attorney. Her daddy, my son, is a computer guy. And so Ruby Kate has the strange mixture of legal language and computer talk, and it comes out in the most charming sorts of ways. And she is thoroughly adamant about most everything. She's also in a fairy princess stage. That's Maggie down on the right-hand side of the picture. So truth in advertising. Oh, one more here. This is the two on the outside are my grandkids. The two on the inside are goats. These four young people have no voice. And if you're old enough to have grandchildren or children, they have no voice in the biggest issue of our time unless it's your voice and my voice. They have no say unless we have the say. And so this is an issue that spills across generational boundaries. And truth in advertising, a good bit of the voltage in my interest and the line in my interest on this subject is because I now have an extension of myself off into the future that I could not have envisioned when I was the age of those of you who are students in the audience. So truth in advertising. Now, let's get down to work. We're running two different kind of deficits. We know a lot about the economic deficit. We hear about it all the time. The economy is bad and banks are collapsing and so forth. The other deficit, of course, is the climate deficit. The roughly 7 billion tons of carbon we put into the atmosphere every year will solve the first deficit. We'll figure that out in some way. The second deficit is fatal. Unless we rectify that 7 billion tons, there's not a person in the room who has any good reason to believe that we can continue to put carbon and run a carbon deficit in the atmosphere and have a decent, sustainable, survivable kind of future. That won't happen. The trick for the Obama administration and for global leaders everywhere is to figure out how you solve the second deficit and the first deficit, or the first deficit without compounding the second deficit. And so this is looking like a lot like a quadratic equation. This is a complicated thing to do. And the stimulus money that was put out this past year for all kind of projects, to the extent it went to build roads and so forth, it's probably a mistake. To the extent it went to build windmills and solar collectors and promote efficiency, it was a good thing. This thing has been, don't you just love Gary Larson? This thing has been coming at us, and it is bigger than it may appear in the science. Take a broad view of this. This is a graphic that appeared in Nature magazine about a month or maybe 2 months ago now. And what you're looking at, the red lines coming out of this indicate the degree of danger or risk involved. And so the green circle in the middle, that is the safety part of this. And so the graphic is unimportant, except it says that in a number of areas we're running now considerable ecological risks, because you all know that. And we have no means of governance yet that would contain those risks, and barely enough to even assess or appraise what those risks are. You may not be able to read that. One of the great things about PowerPoint is you can put things on a screen nobody can read. And you talk learnedly as if everybody's, it's kind of like an eye exam, you know, cover your left eye and see what you can see. But this is a kind of a timeline. And this starts down here with Svante Arrhenius, who was a Swedish scientist, and it comes up here to the current level of CO2 in the atmosphere, which actually is about 390 parts per million now. But in 1896 and 97, Svante Arrhenius was going through a kind of a rough divorce, and he diverted his marital angst into making some of the most incredibly tedious statistical calculations ever made. He was calculating the effect of carbon loading on the atmosphere, and he, by and large, got it just about right. So his numbers are kind of plus and minus 10%, give or take, maybe a little bit better than that. But he got it right. Now, being a Swede, he thought that warming the Earth would be a good thing. So he didn't much object to the warming. But that was the first good data that we had, that we humans were capable of putting heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere and dramatically changing the nature of Earth. And so there have been a series of warnings. You come up through this list, there are a bunch of scientists listed on the screen, and the first IPCC report and now the fourth IPCC report in 2007, and Steve got one of the Nobel Prize winners for the work on that. But in the meantime, carbon has increased in the atmosphere. These are the four assessment reports, and this is roughly where carbon was. And this, of course, is the famous curve developed out of the data of David Keeling from his work in Mauna Loa. But this is kind of what it looks like, and skimming over the science. And I'm going to trust that you all know as much about the science as you probably need to know right now. But this is a graphic. What's on the two screens is a graphic taken from the Stern Review. Nicholas Stern was commissioned by the British Exchequer to do a study of the economics of climatic change. He's an economist that formerly worked at the World Bank. And so across the top here are degrees of change, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees centigrade, not Fahrenheit. And down the left-hand margin are a series of categories: food, water, ecosystems, extreme weather events, and so forth. Now, what you're looking at, you don't need to read the print, which you cannot read unless you have extraordinary eyesight or you brought binoculars. But the color tells the tale. So as you go from left to right and yellow to orange to red, the particular level of risk or damage grows. Y'all with me? So as you get, the color gets darker, things get worse. Now this misleads in two ways. It misleads first because we now know that a good many of a lot of the phenomena depicted in each of these horizontal arrows actually has begun to the left of where Stern shows the arrow. In other words, it's coming at us faster, quicker, and bigger than we thought, even in 2007. It misleads in a second way. If you were to make an accurate diagram or portray climatic change accurately, you'd have lots of cross arrows going back and forth. So clearly what happens to water affects food and ecosystems and so forth. But that would be a graphic too complicated to read. So you all with me? This is where we are now. We've warmed the planet, already warmed at 0.8 of a degree centigrade, again, not Fahrenheit. That's already been done. And this is what we're committed to, another 0.5 to 1 full degree centigrade warming. So that's already in the pipeline. And given the roughly 30-year lag between what comes out of our tailpipes and smokestacks to the climate change-driven weather effects that we see, this is what we can expect in 30 years from now. So what we're now seeing, the abnormalities of ice melting and storms and so forth that we see right now, this is a result of what we did in the late 1970s. And this makes it a particularly tough issue for us. This is not how we're wired. We are wired to respond to direct physical threats. And we were honed by evolution to respond to things that are fast and mean and so forth. The enemy coming over the hill, we respond very well to immediate, dependably loathsome enemies right in front of us. We don't do real well when you talk about parts per million and parts per billion. So there's not any one of you in the audience whose pulse rate's gone up a single beat when you look at that. Your body is tuned to saying, well, look, the colors are, that's sort of pretty, or that's not sharp enough, or whatever, but we're not wired to see this as a threat. You have to think your way through this. And that's the challenge of climatic change. This is where, when we did the President's Climate Action Plan, we brought 250 scientists and climate policy people together, and we asked everybody, where is the point of no return? And virtually to a person, it was 2 degrees centigrade warming. Now, the distance between what we're already committed to, 1.4 to 1.8 degrees centigrade warming, and that point of no return at 2 degrees isn't much. And measured in terms of time, that is virtually nothing. So even though last year the rate of carbon, as your daily paper pointed out, the rate of carbon increase slowed, carbon is still increasing in the atmosphere. It's the rate that has slowed a bit. So there's not much gap between what we're already committed to and this point of no return. John Holdren, President Obama's science advisor, when I asked him what happens at 2 degrees centigrade warming, he really didn't want to respond to that. Mark Linus' book, Degrees of Warming, is maybe a good primer on what is known in the scientific literature about each increment of increase, but it doesn't get pretty. Now, the point of this is this, not that risk starts at 2 degrees centigrade warming. This is kind of a stochastic system. It just passes, it could possibly reach a point of no return. That's what we don't know. And so we're playing with a system, the behavior of which is largely unknown to us. So risk doesn't start at 2 degrees. It just builds up to a point where it may be simply beyond our control. Jim Lovelock, who is arguably the best scientist, independent scientist in the world, describes this rather like being on the Niagara River, just upstream from Niagara Falls and in a boat and losing your engine, and then you're swept over to the side. This is another graphic which is taken from 2001 in the third assessment report and compared with risks that are now, we realize, were worse than we had thought. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side, and again, the color tells the tale. As you go yellow to orange to red, the risks get more severe. So the left-hand side of this, these are identical graphics, the left-hand side of this shows the risks assessment in each of these 5 categories as it was believed to exist in 2001. That was thought to be too explosive to include in the third assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Last year, some scientists went back, reassessed those same risks, and found that, in fact, ecosystems are much more vulnerable to climate forcing than had been expected or thought even 6 years before. So the right-hand graphic indicates a reassessment of risks. This is virtually true, as many of you know, all the way across the science. It turns out to be worse than previously thought, and that has been the pattern. This is a graphic taken from, again, from Science magazine. This is kind of the long tail. Once we introduce carbon into the atmosphere, it doesn't go away quickly. David Archer, a geophysicist at the University of Chicago, puts it this way. The climatic impacts of releasing fossil fuel CO2 to the atmosphere will last longer than Stonehenge, longer than time capsules, longer than nuclear waste, far longer than the age of human civilization so far. Each ton of coal that we burn leaves CO2 gas in the atmosphere. The CO2 coming from a quarter of that ton will still be affecting the climate 1,000 years from now. Now, you take a deep breath, because as Americans, this hits us where we don't want to get hit. We are good at thinking about solving problems, and there's a lot of literature about climate solutions. But what Archer is telling us, and what Susan Solomon is telling us, and what the IPC is saying is this is not solvable in the standard sense of the word. If you have a broken carburetor, that's a solvable problem. If you have something that breaks in a building, that's a solvable problem. There are lots of solvable problems, and Americans are pretty good at solving them if they're technological. But the evidence is increasingly that climate change doesn't fit that word in the way in which we have been using it. So climate change is a problem we hope we can contain, but we cannot fix it. We can't revert back to the climate that we had or would have had, say, 50 years ago or 150 years ago. So global warming, there are days, I'll bet in Missoula, certainly in Oberlin, Ohio, where I live, when the phrase global warming sounds like a good thing. But it isn't global warming. This is entire planetary destabilization. It's important, if we're going to deal with this, to get the name of the thing right. It isn't a warming which sounds kind of benign. It is a total destabilization of virtually everything on the Earth. So rising sea levels, thermal expansion of water, melting ice, storms will get bigger. Disease and famine will spread because we're changing ecosystems. Drought and heat waves will get worse. Ecosystems change. Coral bleaching now is said to affect half the corals on the Earth. Political and economic disorder will spread. This isn't something you have in a little box here called nature, and everything else over here called human systems goes on as normal. This is the kind of thing that will spill across all our boundaries. So the death toll now is estimated 150,000 per year. That number will rise dramatically, according to the World Health Organization. So what's the upshot? Well, we're already committed to substantial warming. Even if today we stop emitting heat-trapping gases, according to IPCC and Susan Solomon and others, sea levels will continue, for example, to rise for yet another 1,000 years. We are quite unaccustomed to think of anything in that time span. There's a lag between the release of heat-trapping gases and the effects that we see. We hope it's not too late to avoid the worst but it is already too late to avoid some kinds of trauma. That's already happening. That's the weather headlines that we see. Duration, who knows? Hundreds to thousands of years. And I think Al Gore has it right that this is the first global emergency, and in its core, this is an ethical issue. And I want to come back to that again at the very end. How do we think about this? Well, one way to think, this is a graphic taken from Bob Carell, who's a climate scientist who's been at the Heinz Center in Washington, D.C. The blue band across the center indicates roughly the range of climatic fluctuation over the past tens of thousands of years, 20,000 years in this graphic. What we take to be human history is about 10,000 years long. This is the era in which we became what it was we became. So we lived in this thing that might, in biblical terms, be called a paradise. Geologists refer to this as the Holocene. This was the era in which we became everything that we became, for better, for worse. This is our poetry, our music, our culture, our history. But now we are evicting ourselves from the only paradise we've ever known, this period of the Holocene. So as we go up to 400 parts per million, 450, 500, or move on higher than that, what we're doing is changing the planet dramatically from the planet in which we grew up. If you're old enough, you remember Walt Kelly's wonderful cartoon character Pogo. Pogo was a possum that lived in the Okefenokee Swamp, and meditating one day on the environmental issue, Pogo concludes that we met the enemy, and it's us. And climate change, all of us have. I have got a carbon footprint. It was expanded a bit by flying out here yesterday. It'll be a little bit larger tomorrow when I fly back. But this is described by people as the perfect problem. The complexity of the science, the time lags, the inertia, the infrastructure, daily habits, denial, the partisan filters, left versus right. It's a liberal versus conservative issue, motivation, collective action. This is the perfect problem. We've never seen anything quite like this. Now, think about how we responded, if you're old enough or know enough history, how we responded to the presumed threat from the Soviet Union from 1947 to, let's say, roughly 1990. There was no price we were not willing to pay. There was nothing we weren't willing to do. And that was a presumed threat. Climatic change, we know for certainty, if you continue to load the atmosphere with carbon and other heat-trapping gases, will trip over and do what James Hansen fears and create a different planet, and one we won't like. So this challenges us in every way. And again, this would be so much easier if we could establish that climate change was something that was caused by Osama bin Laden or some other terrorist group, or if we had a face we could put on this. But the face, we've met the enemy, and it's us. It's all of us in the room. Nicole Krauss, in her book, The History of Love, in describing a Polish village before the Nazi onslaught, said there were rumors of unfathomable things. And because we couldn't fathom them, we failed to believe them until we had no choice and it was too late. And we are at that point of choice now about climatic change. We've waited a long time. The first warning to a U.S. president about the possibilities and the threat of climate change occurred in 1965. 44 years ago. We still do not have a climate policy, and we're not going to get it, apparently, in 2009. So there were these rumors, and increasingly the rumors were not rumors, it was science, and the science became increasingly rigorous and increasingly urgent and increasingly detailed, and yet we have not been able yet to act. And you wonder why. Well, let me give you 3 or 4 reasons why I think we have not yet been able to act on this issue, the largest issue we have ever faced. One is economic concerns drive it out. You're looking at poll data from taken out of the New York Times. This is a Pew Research Center poll data, and you see the red line is concern about the environment. As concern about the economy begins to mushroom in 2008, the gray lines here on either screen go up and the red line begins to drop. We've got priorities wrong. We have failed to see that the economy and the environment are simply parts of the same system. But the environment gets the priority. And then there's this. And this is, again, data taken from recent polls. This is Gallup and Pew poll kind of data kind of blended. So what we're seeing, the long story short on this graphic, is that people no longer believe, or many people no longer believe, that climate change is real. So the number of people who say that climate change is real has now dropped to 55%, and supposedly half of those believe that this is not caused by human beings. Now, this has a lot to do with the fact that Americans don't know nearly enough about science. But one of the problems we have is public opinion relative to the economy. What people hear is the threat is, oh, it's all economic, it's jobs. And there is that threat. That's one of the deficits we run. But the other one is climate and environment and species and so forth. And then there's the problem of media. James Madison, more than anybody else, the author of the U.S. Constitution, said once, a popular government without information or the means to acquire it is either prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Well, what's happened to our media? Is it fair and balanced? The FCC created in 1949 what we call the Fairness Doctrine. All that meant was that if you had gotten a license to use the public airwaves, and they're your airwaves and mine, these are public airwaves, and you didn't have both sides of a particular issue, somebody could complain, take it to court, and you could lose your license. It was called fair and balanced before the words were co-opted. And so that was overturned in 1987. It's still technically on the books, but it is not observed. And so if you go south of where I live in Ohio, just a few miles, the next big city to the south is virtually right-wing radio 24/7. Now, whether you're right-wing or left-wing, that cannot be called balanced. And so some people have easy access to the public through the public airwaves without somebody saying, oh, wait a minute, there's another side to this story. And then when we looked at, when you examine the way U.S. press works, it's been ranked somewhat below the 50th consistently in terms of freedom and access. When Ben Bedikian wrote his classic Media Monopoly in 1983, he complained that there were only 50 major media outlets, and now we're down to 5, one of which is Fox News. This is a study done by the Center for American Progress, and what you're looking at is 2 lines, and they may have washed out just a little bit. The dark blue is the deep right-wing conservatism. The lighter blue is liberal content on talk radio. And so virtually everywhere, even in cities in otherwise liberal or blue states, show the same pattern. Right-wing radio dominates. And right-wing radio, for reasons only known to themselves, has decided that climate change is a hoax, perhaps the largest hoax ever perpetrated on humankind. So there's a problem with media. Our attention is focused on economics. Our media is largely biased or does not do a very good job at reporting a complicated issue. And it isn't spectacular. That's why, do you remember when Terry Schiavo was going through what she was going through, and the debate was going on, should you pull the plug on, should the family be allowed to let her die or not? That was a time when the largest assessment of the planet's health was just done. It's called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report. That report, the day it was released, didn't make the front page of any major U.S. newspaper. It was a small section on page 8, if I recall the page correctly, in the New York Times. Didn't make the evening news, but Terry Schiavo did. So the fact the planet was dying had no particular relevance to the news or the people who decide what is news and what's not. But Terry Schiavo was news and front page news. This is Edward Bernays. And Edward Bernays is a cousin of Sigmund Freud. Came to the United States, helped to popularize Freud's writings. Remember Freud? Remember back in your college readings about Sigmund Freud, there was the superego up there, that's kind of the angel on your shoulder, and there's the ego, that's kind of the rational mind, and then there's the id. That's that trap door down into the nether regions of the human psychology. That's where lust, fear, and all that greed and envy and sloth hang out, the 7 deadly sins. And Bernays, armed with his uncle Sigmund's view of the world and human nature, created the first major template for advertising agencies. And we are all Bernaysians. So he's the guy who he's the person who probably influenced us more than anyone else you've never heard of. So Bernays, hired by the tobacco industry to promote smoking, looks at the market and the potential market, decides, guys are smokers, women aren't. How do you get women to smoke? And so the trick was to get women to express their resentment of men by smoking. And so he had a campaign to get women to smoke, and smoking was smoking little torches of freedom, as he put it. When you want to get guys to buy more cars, what do? Well, you make cars signs of sexual potency. And so the annual style change and use of very precisely engineered sexual allurements attached to a car. So buying a car became an act of extending your sexual potency. But Bernays, in trying to sell things, it wasn't just selling things. Bernays thought that, in fact, this was the only way to maintain a democracy, that you had to get people to buy stuff. So he talked about the engineering of consent, but you've got to get all of us, and you've got to convince us all to buy things, because if we're good consumers, dependable consumers, we'll not be much bothered by public affairs. And so why didn't we pay attention to these rumors of unfathomable things? Well, Edward Bernays didn't want us to, and advertising generally doesn't want us to. Let me show you some of my favorite advertisements. This is for a Chevy truck. And you can read this, hear that, it's the ground whimpering. And you wonder, now this is aimed at you guys, us guys, you wonder if you need to hear the ground whimper, what's your problem? What was it that you missed? And this is on my all-time favorite list of advertisements. This, of course, the rear end of a Hummer, and you wonder why General Motors went bankrupt, poised at the brink. So this is in the red, the print you can't read very well. It says, when the asteroid hits and civilization crumbles, you'll be ready. So presumably if you have a Hummer and things go south on us pretty quickly, you're ready. And you got to say ready for what? This thing gets 6 feet per gallon. You're ready to go walk down the road to find a gas station. I've never known exactly what Dolce & Gabbana make, but I have presumed that they're into sustainable agriculture. They've got a goat, a chicken, and 3 free-range chicks. Don't know what they make. Edward Bernays. There were rumors of unfathomable things, and because we couldn't fathom them, we didn't believe them. Ice melting, not a problem. We sell really cool handbags. Edward Bernays. Not a word about quality, nothing about your superego. This is strictly id. Wake up, people. The sign in the Pepsi Max, and of course, this has nothing to do with your waking up. It has a whole lot to do with selling you yet another caffeinated drink. And this is why Bernays is big part of the reason why if you ask people around the world, what does that stand for, you get close to 100% of people know that this is Coca-Cola, or that is Nike, but they won't know what that one is. And one of those can kill you. Okay, two can kill you. Curve recognition. This is the world that Edward Bernays created, and we're all part of this. And so these rumors of unfathomable things, our media was distorted, our politics largely wrong for media, and then advertising. We have marinated in advertising. This is the world, this is Maslow's famous triangle of self-actualization. You start at the bottom with kind of the infantile need for self-gratification. Then if you get good, you work up through self-mastery. You ought to be into self-mastery by the time you're in the early teens. Self-esteem comes as you get through, you master things, and you have a stable personality, and then actualization, and then transcendence. So if you work your way up this triangle, become a full-stature human being, that's how you do it. Maslow had another idea. You keep people locked in a state of infantile self-gratification. And that's what's happened in America in a large way. Not everywhere, not all of us, not any one of us totally, but to some degree, probably all of us enough of the time. So let's go back to climate change. What are our options? This is what we set out to do. We tried to put together the options for the first 100 days of the Obama administration. Obviously, that's come and gone. A good bit of what we promoted, we did get it to the president. We did have conversations with some of his staff and his transition people and John Podesta and so forth. But you can go on the website and you can download most of the document. We had the document includes some things that are password protected, 190-page review of the legal powers of the president relative to this particular issue before he even has to go to Congress. And some of that has actually occurred. This is the short book that Bill Becker, who did a great job in pulling this whole thing together, wrote. Here's what we have to do, essentially decarbonize the U.S. economy. We've got to go to, on an average, about 22 tons of CO2 per person per year down to 2. That's a major change. I think the good news is I think we can do it. We began with some assumptions that in contrast to Nicholas Stern, the economist, who said that climatic change represents the largest market failure in history, we came to a different conclusion. In fact, long before it was a market failure, this was a political failure. Again, that first warning to a U.S. president about climate change was 1965, 44 years ago. We didn't do anything about it. Why is it a political failure? Well, you know the story as well as I do. We subsidized all the wrong things, and for years and years. Didn't have to do this. You're going to see a slide of just a moment that goes back to 1952, the Paley Commission report. We've had options for a long time and have not acted on this. This is not primarily an economic failure. This is a political failure and a failure of leadership. We concluded early on that we cannot let this stay a left-right issue. This is a transcendent threat, not just to the United States, but to global civilization. This goes well past Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives. We need both. We need people who are good conservatives and we need people who are good liberals. And, you know, we've got a kind of a childish view of the way we do politics. Everybody in this room and everybody in Missoula and everybody in Ohio is on some issues kind of liberal, on other issues kind of conservative. And that balance shifts over time as you grow older and mature. You see things rather differently. But we're not just one thing. We're not just conservatives, and we're not just liberals, and we're not just independents. We're a little mixture of all kinds of things. It's called being a thinking citizen. So we concluded that this has to appeal to lots of different people for, you know, across these typical boundaries. Climate change. We said to the president in this report, it isn't just another issue on a long list of issues, it's the linchpin that holds all those other issues together. Get climate change right, and you'll get lots of other things right. You'll get foreign policy right, economics right, environmental policy right. There's a whole lot. This is a linchpin issue, not just another item on a long list of issues that, oh, once we take care of the economy, we'll get to climate, or once we get to health care legislation, we'll get back to a climate bill. And then it's a national security issue. We brought, during the summer of 2008, right in the heat of the election campaign, we brought together the transition teams for both John McCain and Barack Obama. And we were in the same room. It was a room about a quarter the size of this one, and we had a big table around there, and we had people from the national security establishment, including a couple of flag admirals, and one of them got up in a very dramatic moment, said, if we thought that the Cold War was a security challenge to the United States, we've seen nothing yet. Let climate change go a little bit further, we'll not be able to defend this country. And I looked back over to see what both campaign transition teams were looking like and what they were saying to each other, and you could see that they didn't know how to compute this. But this is the largest national security threat to the United States, not according to me, but according to the Central Intelligence Agency and a number of defense establishments and prominent people in the defense world. And then there's the issue we wrestled with this, of how a president ought to message this. And I don't know, frankly. We hired a Republican PR firm, we hired a Democratic PR firm to look at the issues, and it comes down to rather something like this. On the left-hand side of the screen, Jack Nicholson. Remember the scene in A Few Good Men? Kind of a tense scene. You all remember the movie? You all saw the movie? Tom Cruise is the young JAG attorney, and there's been a murder on the base where Jack Nicholson is the commandant. And Cruise, in this very tense scene, looks at Nicholson and said, I just want the truth from you. And Nicholson spits out these words, you can't handle the truth. Remember that? I can do a better job of that, but I usually have to drink a little bit. And there's a viewpoint there. T.S. Eliot put it, the humankind can't bear much reality. So there's a viewpoint that we're not up to it anymore. But I don't believe that. I really don't. If you come down with a deadly illness, you don't want to go to a doctor who doesn't tell you the truth. You want to hear the truth as best the person understands it. I think the American people are ready for that also, but maybe I'm wrong. Down at the right-hand side of the screen, Winston Churchill. This is that famous portrait of Churchill taken by a Toronto photographer. And by the way, the scene here, that's the most famous picture of Churchill, and the way he got that scowl on the face. Churchill always had a cigar in his mouth, and the photographer reached out, snapped the cigar out of Churchill's mouth, and took the picture almost simultaneously. So what you're seeing is not anger against Adolf Hitler. This is the early stages of oral deprivation. But Churchill, bombs falling on London, and Churchill goes to the British people on BBC, and he doesn't say, hey, this is a great time for urban renewal. He doesn't say, hey, we can beat the Nazis at a profit. No. It's, I don't have a thing to offer you but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He was honest with the British people, and he asked them for heroism, and they responded. Now, the difference for us was that was a war that might be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, but it has a finite lifespan, and then it's over. Somebody wins, somebody loses, but that's not the way climate change is. What we now have to do is really quite extraordinary. We've got to redesign a civilization and then direct our attention at a long term that may take hundreds of years to rebalance climatic systems. So the nature of this makes it particularly hard to message. What we did in the end was to recommend, when in doubt, you tell the truth. And Mark Twain once said that'll amaze your friends and confound your enemies. But the president should tell us the truth. And imagine a presidential speech on climate change done with, PowerPoint, something like this format. But imagine Barack Obama going to the public and delivering the climate equivalent of Franklin Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech, delivered right after the Japanese sunk most of our Pacific fleet at Pearl Harbor. And he didn't temporize. He didn't say, they damaged a few of our boats. They sunk our fleet, and we're going to have to start over again. And this is going to be a long, tough war. And Roosevelt went to the American public and spoke the truth. He asked us to rally. He asked us to do the brave, heroic kinds of things. He asked the finest generation to stand up, and it did. But how do you tell these things to the public? And I don't know. I'm sure I have an answer for that at all. Here are policy options very quickly. The president has a number of things he can do. To some degree, he has done it. Appointments for climate-sensitive and energy positions has been extraordinarily well done. He's going to use procurement power of the federal government, the buying power of the General Services Administration to begin to shift toward low carbon and renewable alternatives. He has yet to use moral suasion in a convincing way. EPA is beginning to regulate CO2 or moving in that direction. Congress, for its part, can tax, it can regulate, or can pass cap-and-trade legislation. These are the problems with this. I'm not going to dwell on this. We can get into this in Q&A if you'd like to. But we've got this, we think taxes are automatically bad. And frankly, I came down after we looked at this to being agnostic between, say, taxes on one side and cap and trade on the other. Taxes for us have become a four-letter word. We don't like taxation. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great Supreme Court justice, however, once said that taxes are the price we pay for civilization. Fairly assessed and put to purposes that otherwise are not achievable in the market, taxes are perfectly fine. But cap and trade, a cap on carbon emissions does give us the level of control. You issue so many permits and you know exactly where you come out. Taxes are a little bit less certain. It's harder to know how much elasticity there is in a certain level of tax. And then there are lots of things. If you go to cap and trade, as it appears we will eventually do, there is the decision about what CO2 level we go for. This is a strictly scientific level. People like Steve Running and Jim Hansen need to tell us what's the safe level or what is the minimum level we can accommodate. And then the question of whether you target big emitters or the whole economy. The big emitters want to be targeted rather than the whole economy because it creates a property incentive for them. The question of whether you auction or give permits, if you simply give them away, you're giving a form of property to people who probably don't need it. There's a question of where you put the cap, whether it's upstream or downstream. It's a technicality, but it's an important technicality. If you put it upstream at the port of entry, at the mine mouth or the wellhead, there are much fewer of those than there are downstream smokestacks and tailpipes and so forth. Much easier to administer. Now, these are details that matter a lot. It sounds like kind of wonky stuff, but this is critically important. This will shape the economy for the next century. So how we make these decisions and by what criteria, and whether a small number of companies benefit or we benefit as a society. If you give away permits, which the Waxman-Markey bill does way too much of, if you give away permits, you get the coal companies to buy in. But the problem is we don't create a revenue stream by giving them away that could come back and help disseminate alternative technologies and help the poor that are going to be most disadvantaged. This simply indicates you're seeing a series of slices as you come closer to the front of this particular graphic. This is the assessment that is continually driven in policy circles by the awareness that climate change is serious. It's coming at us much faster than had been previously thought. What do we do? Well, real quickly, solutions have got to be fast, easy, cheap, resilient, and the fundamental metric here has got to be the amount of carbon removed per dollar spent. And it is really that simple. That's why nuclear power, you'll see in just a second, is a bad deal. But it's got to be, we've got to begin to do some things here in terms of public policy very rapidly and in a way that does not cause other problems. You've seen the advertisements. Coal, the coal industry has spent literally tens of millions of dollars to advertise clean coal. And you've got a fairly sizable coal industry here in the state of Montana, I hear. There was about a 2-mile train in front of us as we came out of the airport yesterday, so you're a coal state. The life cycle of coal, from mining to washing or moving sulfur dioxide for eastern coal in particular for transport, combustion, source of mercury, 50,000 premature deaths by one estimate, the disposal of ash, CO2 sequestration. There is nothing clean about coal. From start to finish, coal is a dirty fuel. It powered us in the 19th century through all the 20th century, and now we've got to leave it in the ground. This is what's happening in West Virginia. If you have not followed mountaintop removal, this is what 1.5 million acres of West Virginia looks like. It's the practice of going after these thin seams of coal. You can see the darker seams here in some of the mountains. Appalachia has about 35 seams of coal. And so this is a way that coal companies can cheaply offload the costs on residents and future generations by destroying one of the most fecund and beautiful ecosystems in the world and simply dumping the debris from the tops of mountains down in the valley. So 1.5 million acres is gone. Blasting on Coal River Mountain started 2 weeks ago, a 40-mile ridge that would have supported, if left in its original state, perhaps as much as 390 megawatts of wind generation power. They'll lower it by 500 to 1,000 feet, and when they do that, the use of that particular site for wind development is purposely destroyed in perpetuity. So for a few years, there's something called cheap coal. We're destroying forever the capacity to generate wind on that mountain. So this is part of our energy. This is part of this dialogue about clean coal. This is another, these are coal sludge dam breaks. And typically, coal sludge, after you wash it, you've got this kind of slurry. It's a little bit like mixing asphalt with gasoline. And those dams are earthen dams, and they break rather routinely in Appalachia. So this is part of this whole thing about clean coal. Carbon sequestration is being talked about a good bit. We don't know that we can sequester that amount of supercritical carbon in perpetuity at a cost we could afford. So we don't know if it's, first of all, if it's feasible to do it. We don't know that we can hold carbon underground forever. And if you can't hold it underground for a long, long time, then there's no reason to do it in the first place. And then there's the cost. We don't know yet what the cost of carbon sequestration, if it can be done reliably and dependably over year after year after year, what it would cost, what it would do to the price of electricity. Or we don't know what it would cost relative to efficiency and renewables. And the cheaper, easier, the low-hanging fruit kinds of options. And then there's the what any good businessman would ask about, the energy return on investment. How much energy do you invest to get how much back out? But if we do go to carbon sequestration in this country, we have to take a volume of material, roughly the same as the volume of material of oil that flows through the U.S. economy, and sequester that underground in the belief that we can hold it underground cheaply and we can actually do this, and it will not lubricate seismic faults and end up with earthquakes and so forth in between. This is Tom Toll's description of this. This is one way to sequester and just leave it there. God put coal deep underground for a reason, and she meant for it to stay there. And then there's nuclear power, an expensive way to boil water. This is a reactor 50 miles from where I live. This reactor came within a very close, very close to a core loss of coolant accident. And the problem was discovered quite by accident when a workman leaned up against a pipe and the pipe gave way, and a hole about the size of a cantaloupe or the diameter of a football showed through the carbon steel. Boric acid had been leaking or had been eating through the containment vessel. When court documents were released, it turned out that this reactor was probably 2 weeks or less from a loss of coolant accident. And if the Davis-Besse plant had melted down and had been a loss of coolant accident of any sizable portion, we would have to have abandoned, we're in the outer abandonment area for a bad loss of coolant accident. So nuclear power, highly subsidized. In France, it's the most subsidized energy source. We subsidize it here also. The reactors are subsidized. If there's a bad accident, you and I are going to pay the cost. It's called the Price-Anderson Act. The safety record of nuclear power is really unknown. A good bit of this has been buried. The reactors still have lots of accidents. Weapons, if you can make a reactor, you're probably a good way toward making a bomb. This is the whole issue with Iran over the past several years. So this idea that you could have peaceful reactors over here and warlike weapons over here and somehow you can keep them separate is not nearly as true as some people want to believe. The cost of nuclear power is huge, probably $7 billion per 1,000 megawatts. The net energy has to be calculated against the mining of uranium all the way over here to waste storage and fuel enrichment, the building of reactors, the operating of reactors, the containment of reactors, the decommissioning of reactors, and then shipping the waste out to some place, and we don't yet know how to handle them. We have closed down in this country 13 reactors. We have yet to decommission the first. It is expensive. It's iffy. We don't really have the technology yet or the know-how to know exactly how to do this. The waste storage is another issue. Then there's the civil liberties issue. If you've spoken out hard and publicly against, let's say, solar collectors or wind power, I doubt that the FBI has a file on you. But if you've spoken out against nuclear reactors, I'll almost guarantee you they've got a file on you. They know who you are. They know where you live. So there's some ways we can generate power that work against the ideas of democracy on which we say this country is founded. So nuclear power is slow, uncompetitive, dangerous. It has a low rate of carbon removal per dollar spent. And the reason is very simply, and you'll see this in another slide in just a moment, that $1 spent on nuclear power as opposed to efficiency is nowhere near as good at removing carbon as efficiency is. You'll see that in just a second. So this is the graphic. This is taken from the McKinsey report. Any questions on this graphic? You bet I can send it to you. Now, what you're seeing here is really important, so listen up. This line is the horizontal line is basically the break-even point. What they depict here are a series of design techniques and technologies, each one off the shelf. We know how to do these things. So below the line, they come in free. So compact fluorescent light bulbs and LED lighting systems and so forth. These are good things to do, and they operate kind of like an endowment. When you get above this line, then the cost starts. So this area is roughly equal to this area. The point of the graphic is, long story short, is that we know enough now, effectively, according to McKinsey, and they're a very conservative outfit, to eliminate about 30% of our energy use and carbon emissions at no net cost. We brought McKinsey in to talk with the President's Climate Action Group, and it turns out if you change a couple of the assumptions, you can easily get to 40 or 50%. Eliminate at no net cost. Now, we've just been through an election campaign in '08. We heard a lot about how to increase supply with clean coal and nuclear power and all that kind of stuff, but very little about how we do what's called demand-side management, which is simply to become as efficient as the technology now permits us to be. This is California. The blue line on both screens here shows this is California energy use per capita. This is U.S. energy use, and it's continued to increase. So there's this gap. This is California economic growth up until the recent financial meltdown. This is U.S. economic growth. So you have to explain two gaps. Why was it California began to cut per capita energy use, but still grew faster than the United States? Part of the answer, a big part of the answer, is that California Public Utility Commission did something that was very smart. They decoupled sales from profitability. In other words, they raised the rates of electricity and told everybody you're going to be paying more, but then they helped people become efficient. So if you bought a refrigerator 10 or 15 years ago, you bought a machine that used roughly 1,500 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. But state-of-the-art now, you can go to Sears, and state-of-the-art is roughly 350 kilowatt hours or less. And if you want to spend a little bit more, you can buy a machine that's around 200 kilowatt hours per year. This simply depicts the savings from California. This is hard money, and that is roughly 15% of what they would have consumed has been eliminated and saved. Hybrid auto sales way up in this country. We know how to conserve energy. This is not something we can do maybe in the future. It's something we have the capacity to do right now. Plug-in vehicles are on the way quickly, and a number of manufacturers are beginning to develop these. Now, there's some. I'm going to skip over this to this particular graphic. There are some ironies in this, and we've got to become students of energy. The more energy we save, the more we've got to use for other purposes. So this is called the Jevons paradox. William Stanley Jevons, in a book back in the 19th century called The Coal Question, described this in some detail. And so it isn't just a matter of saving energy. We have to figure out how to divert the savings into something that doesn't add carbon emissions. Renewable energy, we've known about this for a long time. This, again, is a political failure. The Paley Report in 1952 indicated that we could save a lot of energy. We could power a good bit of the country by solar power, not by 2050 or 2030, but by 1990. We didn't do it. We had the evidence. It wasn't a matter of technology. It wasn't a matter of economics. It was a matter of politics. Again, political failure. The evidence, however, is overwhelming. We could power this country by renewables. The current issue of Scientific American, now at the newsstand, has an article on how we can do this with wind power and solar, and doesn't even get very far into efficiency. So 4 states, there's enough wind power in Kansas, Texas, and the Dakotas to power the country. We could figure out how to move the electrons to the coast, but we are an energy-rich country. And yet to hear the public dialogue or hear Congress talk about this, it sounds as if we're an energy-poor country. Wind power, the fastest growing source of energy now, competitive with coal, even in places like Ohio. This is a wind field about 40 miles from where I live. Wind power is now competitive with baseload coal. Even with an economic downturn, wind is still doing pretty well. This is photovoltaic material, photo as in photograph and voltaic as in voltage. Again, a very rapidly growing market. Within 10 years, photovoltaics will be probably down at 8 or 9 cents a kilowatt hour and roughly competitive with baseload coal. This is our Senator Sherrod Brown on top of the Lewis Center. And Sherrod, after I took this picture, Sherrod asked, where did we get the material for that particular array? And I said, well, Sherrod, our choices were we could buy from Germany, or you get it from Japan, but you couldn't buy that in the United States. And of course, the irony was not lost on him. 24 miles from where he's standing on that building, the NASA Glenn Space Center is where a good bit of the technology was developed for photovoltaics. On the other side of us to the west, First Solar, one of the largest solar manufacturers in the United States, had just sold all its production to Germany for 5 years because they had something called feed-in tariffs. This is a public policy issue. What's the transition look like? Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. What's the transition look like? Not particularly painful. It means doing the things we know how to do. Efficient transport, CAFE standards or corporate average fuel efficiency standards, which have gone up. the use of fee-baits to encourage people, I can explain that later in a Q&A if you'd like, but to encourage people in a revenue-neutral way to buy efficient appliances and cars and so forth. High-performance buildings, can we make buildings powered effectively by sunlight? Absolutely. Can you make them cost-effective? Absolutely. Energy efficiency, distributed energy, photovoltaics, wind power, microturbines, the technology is rapidly moving ahead. Economics that allows us to tell the truth by the things that we buy, prices that tell the truth. And putting taxes on waste, not work, and the right and the left ought to be able to come to agreement on that. And then ending subsidies for all the things that we really don't need. Subsidies on deforestation and subsidies on overbuilding things and subsidies for power generation and fossil fuels. So what's a life in a post-greenhouse world look like? If we allow it to go too far, it will be a kind of hell. And somebody needs to tell the American public that. It isn't doom and gloom. It's called the science. We have to have the courage to face that fact and act with a degree of wartime emergency, a sense of urgency that this has to be done. It is now an issue of governance and ethics. So if we act in time, what's it look like? Well, gee, local farms, local food, lots of solar collectors and windmills. We walk and bike more, local businesses, regionally appropriate skills, front porches, community as a verb, not necessarily as a noun, fewer shopping malls, less traffic, no wars for oil, no oil money in politics, cleaner air. We can relearn self-reliance, and you can extend that list a long, long way. Bad? I don't think so. I think that sounds pretty good. There are some things that are missing there. U.S. empire, I don't think that we can maintain roughly 850 military bases around the world. I don't think we can expend $1 trillion on either war fighting or military budgets and get to this world. I think there are going to have to be some changes. Summary, there is a consensus, and it is absolute consensus. There is virtually no dissent. If you put heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, we trap heat. Put a whole lot of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, you trap a whole lot of heat. It really is kind of simple. Lots of complexities that Steve can talk about, but there's not really any serious dissent. The people who study climate for a living and have to live by the rigors of peer review, fact, logic, data, and evidence are virtually in agreement. The second point, this is unfolding faster at a larger scale than thought even a few years ago. If this had been revealed as a terrorist plot, it would have been easier for us to act, but we've met the enemy, and it's you and me. The scale and duration, it is effectively permanent. Allowed to go too far, we will have created what Jim Hansen probably said here a couple of years ago. We will have created a different planet, a different Earth, and one we're not going to like much. There is in this, there are tipping points. There are nasty surprises. This is what you call a non-linear system. 2 + 2 isn't always 4 in these systems. And there are that last straw that can break the camel's back. It is non-linear. But finally, the risks that we're taking are utterly and totally foolish risks. We're acting as if we have all the time in the world to get a climate bill through. And we've got to accommodate the status quo and all the interests. But if you ask the public, would you want to run those kinds of risks? Would you get in a car, let's say, if the risk of a fatal crash in that car was 1 in 10, would you? If it was 1 in 100, would you? 1 in 1,000? I don't think so. But we're taking those risks now with the entire Earth in perpetuity. Let me close with a couple last thoughts. This is the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. It's the last time the word posterity appears in the Constitution. There is no very effective case law that deals with posterity, but this is the right of future generations. This is my grandkids and their grandkids and yours, that if we don't speak up for them, no one else will. If we don't act effectively on their behalf, no one else will. They have no rights other than the rights that you and I will arrogate to them and defend for them. So the rights are listed in the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment. It's the right to enjoy property and life and happiness and liberty. And without those rights, without the protection that you and I would give them, they have none. They are totally vulnerable. Tom Berry, one of the great thinkers of our time, theologian and philosopher, wrote a book back in the late 1990s called The Great Work. And the great work of any generation is not something you ask for. The people who fought against slavery in the U.S. Civil War didn't want to go fight and die in places like Antietam or Shiloh or Gettysburg, but they did. And what Tom Brokaw calls the greatest generation, they didn't ask to go fight in places like Iwo Jima and the Battle of the Bulge, but they did. They did their work because it was their duty to do it. It was the right thing to do. For our generation, the great work is rather simple. It is we have to, with a sense again of wartime emergency and urgency, we have to stabilize greenhouse gases. We have to understand enough about how the planet works as a physical system and how all the systems that we're involved in calibrate, actually affect those systems, how these things are related. We have to stop the emission of heat-trapping gases, and time is not our friend here. And second, flip that over to the other side of the coin. We've got to make a rapid transition to a world powered by sunlight and efficiency. And the good news of that is that we can do it. The technology exists. Virtually every report, every analysis that looks at this says that this is now possible to do. We've got to thirdly build a post-carbon economy that works. Prosperity without having to subsidize ourselves at the expense of posterity. And I think we can do that. We have to create a global bargain, and this is what the whole Copenhagen meeting is all about. Our army doesn't help us. Our economic prowess doesn't help us here at this point because China can sink the boat. As your local paper said this morning, India can sink the boat. We can do it. Europe can do it. We've got to come together. And military force is not much of an asset to us in this kind of issue. And then we've got to, I think, go deeper. This isn't, as it is commonly described, just an issue of economics. It is not an issue just of technology. It is certainly both of those things. But this is an issue of how we make the human presence on the planet. This is the whole sustainability dialogue. Can we build a civilization that is fair and decent and has staying power? And one that our children or grandchildren or their grandchildren will look back and see that we made the right choices in this time, and it was really our finest hour. And then finally, the change in politics. And I think that we have started this. I think we've begun to see that we are trustees for future generations and other life forms. I think the election of 2008 was a step in this direction, small step perhaps, but a step in this direction. That now, if you ask, is there a worldwide movement to defend the planet and the rights of the future and create a safe haven for future generations, I think the answer is yes. I think we've crossed the threshold. But now it's up to us. We've got to take this up to the next level. This is a matter of changing the way we conduct the public business to see it isn't just about private interest. This is about our common collective interest as life forms and as protectors of life on this planet. Thank you very much.
David would be happy to take some questions, but we ask that you approach the microphone because this is going to be podcast. So please, if you have questions for David, come on up.
Dr. Orr, thank you very much for coming and for stamping out uninformed happiness as much as you can. I think it's certainly critical that we use all our ingenuity and technology to increase efficiencies, that we examine our societies and try to create a more socially just and simpler living society. But all these efforts, I think, will be sunk if we don't also confront population and say that population stabilization and a humane, slow reduction of the human population is absolutely essential to doing anything about climate change.
Yes, I agree. population is a tough issue. If you remember your history, in 1972 at the Stockholm Conference, the first conference, the global conference on environment, the issue of population was a major issue. And the concern at that time was basically it was white folks like Americans and affluent countries shaking their fingers at mostly the rest of the world and saying, y'all quit breeding. And that was about the position we took. By the time you got to the Cairo conference and the Beijing conference, it was clear that this was a lot more complicated issue. It was an issue of consumption, our overconsumption. We do a lot more damage per person to the world than, say, somebody born in Bangladesh or Pakistan or whatever. And it was an issue of women's rights. And so it was access to microloans and education opportunity for everybody, but particularly for women. And that brought the dialogue, that brought the issue to a very different level. It wasn't just our, chiding other people for having 4 and 5 and 10 kids. It was our consumption, and it was beginning to change the social fabric. And so development largely is now seen as the best way to control population. But it's a tough issue. We are now 7 billion of us on the planet, and it's said we'll peak at around 9.2 is the UN median estimate. So it is a tough issue. This population surge will continue. It's going to make everything a lot more difficult. We've got to create a world that will have 2 billion more people on it. That's much more food and energy and development and all the kind of pressure. But E.O. Wilson describes this era as the bottleneck era. And it's going to be a tough row to hoe. On the other side of population, however, there is no good way to coerce people not to have babies. Kenneth Boulding, the economist, was asked about this one time, and he proposed a licensing system for parenthood. So if you want to have kids, you have a birth license. And so you want to raise population, you give people maybe license for 2 more units of life. You want lower population, you give them a fraction of 1 unit. And then you'd have to go to the market to buy the remainder so you could have a complete human being. And then he was asked about what would you do with people who didn't follow the rules, and his suggested punishment was assign them to or condemn them to work for a year in a daycare center. But it's a pretty tough issue to coerce, and fortunately, I think that the path of development and what Muhammad Yunus has experimented with in terms of micro-lending is a pretty good way to do this. But it is an issue, and we can't sweep it under the rug. But it's part of this dialogue that has largely disappeared about population and something called carrying capacity. How many of us can be sustained within the limits of a particular system? Yes.
You talked briefly about upstream, and because we have maybe a naive belief in capitalism as solving many of our problems, is some kind of an upstream solution, either the cap and trade or taxes, a good way to really have this filter through our relatively, without all kinds of economic change?
Yeah, well, upstream, by the way, refers to where you put either taxes or permits. And so upstream means mine mouth, wellhead, or port of entry where fossil fuels enter the economic stream. Downstream refers to giving rights or auctioning rights to primarily the large users. In 1976, I was part of the transition team for Jimmy Carter. And we proposed at that time an upstream tax, largely as a severance tax on fossil energy. And the simplicity of having it upstream is that there are fewer mines and wells and ports of entry for fossil fuels as they come into the economy than there are smokestacks and tailpipes and so forth. So it's just a lot easier to administer. And then the effects effectively then ripple through the whole economy. So if you raise the price, if you tax energy, let's say at the mine mouth or at the wellhead, that means that when you buy a gallon of fuel or a kilowatt hour of electricity from a mine, the tax is already built into the price, and it ripples through the economy. It would change the economy, and it would require, if done smartly, that we would have advance warning that the prices are going to go up. So as you begin to plan for the next refrigerator or next car or your next house or whatever it might be, you know that you're now shopping for the most efficient thing on the market. And so that kind of information is very useful for households, but it's also incredibly important for businesses. So they can begin to do long-term planning. And they know there are alternatives. And then on the other side, if we help utilities and other companies called ESCOs or energy service companies help us become more efficient, then we've got a way to reduce demand and become more efficient while the prices go up. That's exactly what California's done. And done on a more rigorous basis and done on a national basis, I think we'd see dramatic changes. Then on the other side, you'd see lots of businesses begin to flourish in renewable energy and efficiency equipment. So there are lots of reasons to want to do that. But anyway, it would change a great deal. Steve?
You know, I can at least imagine how we as a nation could make the sort of transitions that you're recommending, and I hope we do. But I really struggle to imagine how in the international arena, with the lack of international governance, that we could ever get a global consensus and then on progress forward, and then a global mechanism of, for want of a better word, enforcement. I don't think any country that signed the Kyoto 1 Accord actually met their targets. And so if we sign a Kyoto 2 Accord and nobody meets their targets, then what do we do?
Next question. Steve, yeah. Now, let's be honest. We are the hogs. I mean, the 800-pound gorilla in this conversation is you and me. That 22 tons of carbon you and I are responsible for every year. If you look at the atmosphere as a big bucket, I mean, you know the numbers much better than I do. Why am I talking about this? But as we have this big bucket, we've put in, what is it, 28 to 30% roughly of the CO2 level that's already resident in the atmosphere. And now we turn around and say to the rest of the world, oh, y'all quit developing because you're going to change our climate. Now, that isn't, you know, you saw the document signed by 50 African countries recently. That isn't going to make it. Now, let's be honest. The only thing we can control here is our own behavior. And what's really called for in this country is that you and I, as Americans, we step up and we take responsibility. It's called being an adult. Now, if the rest of the world doesn't do this, you know, okay, we don't know that we're going to survive this. And nobody in this room can say that. And this is no time. If you're optimistic about this, you don't know enough. If you're in despair, that's a sin. You don't want to go there. The only option we have is called hope. But hope, as I see it, and I said this in the book, is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. It means we've got to be active. And hope is the only. So what do we do as hopeful Americans? I think all I know to do personally, and this is part of the personal story, is to try to make my little city a carbon-positive city and do what's necessary to build an economy there that works and a food system and all the things that were described this afternoon. That's all I know how to do. You in Missoula have a different agenda and so forth, but collectively, we have to step up in this country, and if we don't, there is no reason why the Chinese should. And there's no reason why the Indians should. And there's no reason why the Africans should. And what means stepping up? It means we've got to get an energy policy in this country with real teeth and real purpose. And we've got to begin to, you know, all the things that we've talked about here and lots more that you know more about than I do. But we have to do that. That isn't an option. And we got to stop thinking, oh, gee whiz, this is going to cost too much. You know, if your kid gets sick, you don't sit around as a parent and say, oh, I don't know, you know, what's Bobby worth to me? You don't do cost-benefit analysis when things are important. You know, on the slavery issue, Abraham Lincoln didn't toy with, you know, what's the value of a slave? Well, you know, versus a machine. It wasn't a cost-benefit calculation. There's some things you don't do. And we've got to come to the point you don't load the atmosphere with carbon and other heat-trapping gases. There's some things you do not do. So this is first and foremost, for me, it is a moral and ethical issue, exactly as Al Gore says. Once you get the category right, then you're asking, okay, what's the smartest possible way to do the right thing? That's the economic question. And we've got economics and ethics, you know, the cart and the horse in the wrong relationship to each other. So there's no reason, pardon me, I didn't take my Ritalin today, so I'm all hissied up. You just have to live with that. But you get the point. This is an ethical issue, and it's an issue that is going to require governance first, not markets. And some of my best friends are all for market changes and natural capitalism, and I'm all for it 2 days, maybe 3 days out of the week. The others, I'm not. I mean, we need markets to get adapted, but we need governments to work with them. This is a three-legged stool, and after the collapse of the last year and a half, we now know there was a good bit of the market stuff that was absolutely fraudulent. We weren't as rich as they were telling us. And the economic theory of Alan Greenspan that foxes can guard the chicken house, it wasn't good for the chickens, and eventually it wasn't good for starving foxes. So we had to bail them out. But this is first and foremost a governance and ethics issue, and it's got to happen here. If it doesn't happen here, we are sunk. Now, if it happens here, we could still be sunk. But we are totally unconvincing to anybody in the third world until we get our house in order. We are profligate when it comes to energy, and that sermon is over. Anyway, thanks for the opportunity to rant there, Steve. Yeah, one last here.
Yeah, you've kind of mentioned personal responsibility in all of this and what we as individuals can do, kind of rolling up the sleeves and stuff. And you had, one of the bullet points was about supporting local farms and growing food locally. I'm wondering also, in addition to that, what role you think reducing meat consumption or eliminating it from the diet has to play in terms of energy intensiveness and fossil fuel consumption?
Well, I'm not a vegetarian myself, but what I try to do personally is to eat meat from either I've raised it myself or it's local and it's grass-fed. So feedlot beef, feedlot chickens, and so forth, I think are wrong. But you're right that meat is a huge factor in carbon emissions. And we see this development pattern as countries get richer, the diet shifts from traditional diets of long on grains, vegetables, and legumes and so forth to meat. And then you see other things begin to happen. Colon cancer and heart disease and other things begin to rise with it. So how we eat does affect lots of other things. And thanks for the point. I think it is an issue. I didn't get into it here, but I think that if you are a meat eater, I think shifting your diet to consume only locally raised, preferably grass-fed beef, not feedlot beef. It's important for ethical reasons, it's important, but I can't personally say that eating meat is all wrong. I don't believe that. But I think it's important how it's raised. It is an ethical issue, again, with animals and animals' rights. And I'm not going to go as far as some people, I think, want to go on that issue, but I think it is an important issue. And it certainly has climatic or implications for the climate, you bet.
Yeah, to use your example you cited earlier, Winston Churchill, his big problem he had of convincing people to his point of view in the 30s was finally taken care of by the smoking gun, the invasion of Poland. Mm-hmm. And in the ozone layer problem with the freons, that problem was kind of taken care of with the ozone hole in the Antarctic, where people got on board and believed it. Do you see us having any chance of a similar smoking gun occurring with this problem?
Boy, a good question. You're right about Churchill. And Churchill's point, I mean, a lot like Al Gore and Jim Hansen back in the late 1980s, what Churchill was saying to the British people is you better pay attention to Central Europe, and if you don't, they'll be held to pay. They didn't, and there was. And so people who are saying that climate change, this rumor of unfathomable things happening, and there have been prophets that go back into the 30s and 40s. You can find people beginning to, the warnings begin to get more urgent as the clarity of the science became more pronounced. Climate change, I think, and Steve's the right guy to ask the question too, but climate change, I think, is hard. First of all, because we don't see the Tuvalu Islands. We don't see people having to abandon their ancestral homes because sea levels are rising, and we don't pay that cost. And what the World Health Organization says, 150,000 people die each year of climate change-driven weather events. And we don't see those. Those are dispersed. That's Bangladesh, or that's Europe, that's Iowa last year in June, that's, it's dispersed. It's not like one big airliner crashes and 150,000 people are killed. It's not like 9/11. It's not a pronounced event. It's random. It's distributed. And then it's distributed over time. And we're not attuned. These things also happen for other reasons. There are big storms, and there are droughts, and there are heat waves that have always accompanied human engagement with climate. So it makes it harder. It's a cumulative kind of thing as I see climatic change until we flip that over into some other state. And the summer you had a couple years ago, last time I was in Missoula, it was 107 degrees, I think, if I remember correctly, for a couple of days. But that becomes the norm, and you have 100-degree plus temperatures for, let's say, 4 months. That'll get our attention. Or it doesn't rain, and the rains just stop in the southeast, as they did for a while, and now the rains come back. Or you got to abandon, Jim Powell, a geologist, says that in his book Dead Pool, says that Phoenix Valley sometime between 2020 and the mid, say 2025, effectively is a dead pool, no water, no electricity. That'll get our attention. But in the meantime, it's just this kind of, it's like watching fireflies on a summer night. There's a little bit of evidence there, and one over here, and one over here, and one over there. And connecting the dots is really hard for us. And I think that this is partly the way we're hardwired. I think it's also partly an educational failure. We have not equipped people to see systems and patterns. Not very well. And so this is part of the silo education. You are a physics major or an economics major or whatever your major is, but we don't talk back and forth much between it. And you remember the story about how the ozone hole was discovered. Mario Molina and Sherry Rowlands is a story was told by Mario. We were having lunch one day. Mario was a grad student. Sherry was his professor. And they just happened to be randomly studying two different things. One is what happens when you release chlorofluorocarbons while they go up. What happens when they get up there? Well, they destroy ozone. And so they discovered this quite by accident, that we had a huge problem. So it's not like somebody is sitting there at the console planet Earth and you're studying gauges and dials. We don't, we stumble on things. And you kind of have this, oh my God, we're doing what? Kind of attitude or reaction. But in climate change, you'll see if you follow the weather events, and increasingly the climate press is good at reporting stuff, but it doesn't get out much to the public. And again, back on my media comments, the way the media portrays this, the media doesn't like anything that is complicated. And climate, well, we did that last year. And it's so boring and it's so complicated. And, we're now people who, if you study, remember the study that came out a few weeks ago that showed the grade level for Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address. And the grade level to comprehend that particular address was like the 11th grade reading level, according to the authors of the study. You get down to George Bush, we're down to about the 4th grade level. And it isn't George Bush. It's George Bush, yeah. But it's that we have been dumbed down. And the comprehension level to watch television is what? Nothing. A 3-year-old can watch TV just fine, or you can be 90 and watch TV just fine. Brain goes, flatlines in either case. But we have been dumbed down. And I'll tell you one other thing while I'm on this rant. Susan Jacoby, the wonderful book back in 1963 by Richard Hofstadter called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And Susan Jacoby, in a book called The Age of Unreason, which you can get in paperback, great book, came out 2 years ago. The forces of unreason have expanded, and we in education have not done nearly enough to counteract this. So we have people leaving 4 years of college who never read another serious book in their lives. And we sit there and watch television, CNN, or whatever, and we have been dumbed down. John Taylor Gatto, the author of Dumbing Us Down, I think had it right. And part of the reason is, the advertisements, Edward Bernays' work. What's a Bernaysian advertisement? It is to dumb us down. Don't think about your choices. Be a dependable, dependent, and ignorant consumer. Because if you're otherwise, you're a good neighbor, you're a competent person, you know how to do for yourself, you're a lousy consumer, And so to make the economy work, you really do need a passive and kind of stupid population. And we're fulfilling that. Get me off the hook. I'm out on a long limb here. Please ask a question that, anyway, go ahead.
I was actually going to say that I significantly disagree with your last statement.
Oh,
about,
okay, good.
About
Good.
your very last statement. I don't think that just because a population is educated well, that it makes it have a very poor economy. In fact, I think if you have an intelligent, educated population, you can have a very, very good economy, as we have seen in Europe, as our education levels have dropped and theirs have surpassed us. But it was interesting that you chose to turn that way, because I have two fairly
Wait, say
similar
that a little
questions.
bit more. You're saying education and what are not correlated?
Economy. That education and economy can be found to be correlated if you look at the levels of rise. I mean, just in my own uneducated perspective, if you look at the levels of rise in education in Europe and their rise in economic situation, especially comparatively to our lack in education or drop in education in the last 50, 100 years or so, and our now very evident economic issues, I wouldn't go so far as to say that if you have a highly educated population, you have a poor economic situation within that nation. I think they can do very well together, having high education and prosperity.
I think I'm in
economically.
agreement with you, if I understand your point.
Okay.
My argument is that education really has failed to produce people who are thoughtful, critical thinkers, and also independently minded. And I think that we have certainly failed in terms of civic education, in terms of equipping people to understand the terms by which we would conduct the public business in a democratic society. But no, I think I agree with you, and thanks for making that point.
My question was twofold. How do you propose, or do you at all advocate within your lecturing and your touring and your book writing as a public figure in this discussion? Do you advocate for higher education as a predominant force behind the changes that we can achieve and need to achieve? And do you advocate for government policy change within that, within education and within funding for people who can afford the hybrids or, the couple $100 more expensive refrigerator? I know the long-term cost is much more beneficial than the short-term cost, but do you advocate for those things when you're talking publicly about this subject?
Short answer is yes. Let me say two things real quickly. One is higher education is, there are 4,000 some institutions of higher education, incredible buying power, access to 14 or 15 million young Americans. I mean, an amazing source of creativity and energy. And for us to stand idly by and simply turn out kind of the standard issue of student, I think is wrong at this time. I think there's a larger vision for higher education, and that's what I've advocated for relative to my own peer group. That our buying power, our example, we can become drivers. I mean, the Oberlin Project is to use our cloud as a college to become a driver in the creation of a green economy. But imagine 4,000 institutions, more or less, getting behind this idea and using their buying power, their education power, their students, their faculty, and so forth in their situation in communities to help drive the emergence of green economies. Secondly, on government issue, lots of ways to think about how governments and higher education can work together. And there's a good bit of that's going on now in trying to get government to help support environmental education and the transition to carbon neutral colleges. But imagine one kind of tangential point. Imagine that if we said to every American, you have the right to have a sabbatical, that will pay for every 7 years, let's say, one semester of work in a college or educational institution of your choosing. I think that would be the best investment we could ever make. It would be costly, but I think it's one of those things that's an investment in ideas and in our people that we are now unwilling to make. And I see far too many students leave our college and colleges like it that are expensive with a lien on future income that I think is criminal. I don't think anybody ought to graduate from college owing anything. I think that is as much a right, it goes back to Franklin Roosevelt's 1944 speech. I think it's a right to have that education if you want it. and to come out of that without a lien on your future income, so you got to compromise your job search and so forth, and you come out of college owing, in some cases, $40,000 or more. But thanks for that question.
Thank you, David.